Benjamin Netanyahu's life is not just the story of a politician. It is the story of Israel itself, a nation forged in conflict, defined by resilience, and driven by a search for security in a turbulent region. Few leaders in modern times have left such a powerful imprint on both domestic politics and international diplomacy as Benjamin Netanyahu. Known to his supporters as a guardian of Israel's safety and prosperity, and to his critics as a divisive and polarizing figure, Netanyahu's journey spans decades of war, peace talks, elections, controversies, and comebacks. His story is one of determination, strategy, survival, and relentless ambition. Born on October 21, 1949 in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu entered the world just 1 year after the establishment of the State of Israel. His birth itself was symbolic, a child of a brand new nation destined to grow up in an environment of uncertainty, hope, and constant struggle. His family background shaped his outlook in profound ways. His father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, was a historian specializing in Jewish history, particularly the Spanish Inquisition. Ben-Zion was not just an academic, but also a staunch Zionist and political activist, deeply committed to the idea of a strong Jewish homeland. This atmosphere of intellectual rigor and nationalist conviction deeply influenced young Benjamin. The Netanyahu household was one of discipline, intellectual debate, and an unshakable belief in Jewish survival. Benjamin, often called Bibi by family and friends, was the second of 3 brothers. His older brother, Yonatan Yoni Netanyahu, would later become a national hero after leading the daring Entebbe hostage rescue mission in 1976, in which he tragically lost his life. His younger brother, Ido, became a radiologist and playwright. Growing up in such a family meant that responsibility, courage, and a sense of destiny were never far from daily life. In the early 1960s, the Netanyahu family moved to the United States, where Ben-Zion worked as a professor. This move exposed Benjamin to Western culture, values, and education at a young age. Living in America had a profound effect on him. Unlike many Israeli politicians of his generation, Netanyahu became fluent in English, mastered the art of public speaking in the American style, and absorbed the culture of media-driven politics. This would later set him apart from his rivals and give him an unmatched advantage on the international stage. Benjamin attended high school in Philadelphia, where he was known as Ben Nite. He excelled academically, but also demonstrated a serious, somewhat reserved personality. Unlike many teenagers of his age, he was already deeply aware of political and security issues. He often wrote essays on Jewish history, Israel's survival, and the challenges of living in a hostile environment. His American classmates remembered him as a disciplined young man who was focused on his identity and future. In 1967, Netanyahu returned to Israel and soon joined the Israel Defense Forces, IDF. Like many Israeli youth, military service was not optional, it was a duty. But for Netanyahu, it became a defining chapter of his life. Before diving into his military years, it is important to note the timing. Israel was entering one of the most dangerous and transformative periods of its history. The Six-Day War had just reshaped the map of the Middle East, and tensions with Arab neighbors remained extremely high. This was the atmosphere in which Benjamin Netanyahu came of age, a world where survival required vigilance, courage, and sacrifice. But even before donning the uniform, his personality had already been molded by a unique mix of influences. His father's intellectual nationalism, his brother Yoni's sense of duty and bravery, and his own exposure to American culture. This combination created a figure who was both Israeli to the core and yet remarkably comfortable in the West. Someone who could move between Jerusalem and Washington with ease. Someone who could speak to both Israelis living under constant threat and Americans seeking a reliable ally in the Middle East. As Netanyahu entered the IDF, he would soon learn lessons of leadership, resilience, and personal loss that would follow him for the rest of his career. His years in uniform would be the crucible that forged his identity, transforming him from a bookish student into a soldier, and eventually into a man who believed that strength and security must always come before compromise. This was the beginning of Benjamin Netanyahu's journey. The child of a historian, the brother of a future hero, and the young man standing at the intersection of two worlds, Israeli and American war and diplomacy tradition and modernity. His early years laid the foundation for everything that would come. His political strategies, his communication style, and his vision of Israel as a nation that must always stand strong, no matter the odds. Benjamin Netanyahu's entry into the Israel Defense Forces marked the first major turning point in his life. In 1967, at the age of 18, he joined the army during one of the most turbulent periods in Israel's history. The shadow of the Six-Day War loomed large, and Israel's survival seemed constantly at stake. Like most young Israelis, military service was not a choice, but an obligation. Yet for Netanyahu, this experience would go far beyond duty. It would shape his worldview, strengthen his sense of discipline, and provide him with a reputation for courage. Netanyahu served in the elite Special Forces unit, Sayeret Matkal, one of the most prestigious units in the Israeli military. This was no ordinary assignment. Sayeret Matkal was tasked with high-risk counterterrorism and reconnaissance missions, requiring extraordinary physical and mental toughness. Netanyahu proved himself capable in this intense environment, participating in several covert operations. His commanders remembered him as disciplined, sharp, and courageous. He was wounded during a mission, a scar that served as a lifelong reminder of the sacrifices demanded by Israel's constant struggle for survival. These years of service forged in Netanyahu a philosophy that would remain central to his political career, that Israel could never afford weakness. The young soldier came to believe that compromise without strength would lead only to disaster. He also learned to respect precision, strategy, and meticulous preparation, qualities that later defined his political campaigns and negotiations. After completing his military service, Netanyahu briefly studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, but soon returned to the United States for further education. He enrolled at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, one of the world's most prestigious universities. At MIT, Netanyahu studied architecture and later completed a master's degree in management. His academic years in the U.S. were crucial, not only for the knowledge he gained, but also for the way they expanded his worldview. At MIT, Netanyahu combined technical discipline with political curiosity. He became fascinated with international affairs, economics, and the future of global security. Professors and fellow students noted his serious demeanor, his focus on Israel's survival, and his ability to articulate complex ideas with clarity. While most students were immersed in their academic work or campus life, Netanyahu balanced his studies with constant involvement in discussions about Israel's security challenges. Netanyahu's time in America also gave him something unique among Israeli leaders, a mastery of English that sounded natural to American ears. He adopted the communication style of U.S. politicians, learning to deliver arguments with clarity, confidence, and persuasive power. This skill would later make him one of the most effective Israeli leaders on the world stage, particularly in Washington. During his stay in the United States, Netanyahu also worked at the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, where he met a young Mitt Romney, the future U.S. presidential candidate. The two men formed a professional respect for one another, highlighting the connections Netanyahu began to build with influential figures in American politics and business. These relationships would later prove invaluable as he navigated U.S.-Israeli relations. But Netanyahu's years in America were interrupted by personal tragedy that would define the rest of his life. In 1976, his brother Yoni Netanyahu led the daring Israeli commando raid to rescue hostages at Entebbe Airport in Uganda. The operation was a stunning success. More than 100 hostages were freed, but Yoni was killed in the mission. His death shook Israel to its core, and for Benjamin, it was devastating. Yoni was not only his older brother, but also a role model, a symbol of courage and self-sacrifice. The Entebbe raid turned Yoni into a national hero, immortalized as a symbol of Israel's determination to protect its people. For Benjamin, it was a deeply personal loss that fueled his own sense of duty. He often described Yoni's death as the defining moment of his life, pushing him to dedicate himself to the service of Israel. It also shaped his political message, that Israel must always be strong, because the price of weakness was paid in blood. In the years after Yoni's death, Netanyahu founded the Jonathan Institute, an organization dedicated to studying and promoting international cooperation against terrorism. Through conferences and publications, he began to build a reputation as an expert on terrorism and security. This platform gave him access to political leaders, scholars, and policymakers around the world. Netanyahu's speeches at these events showcased his ability to articulate Israel's perspective to an international audience, forcefully, clearly, and persuasively. His growing reputation soon opened the door to politics. In the early 1980s, Netanyahu joined Israel's diplomatic corps, serving as deputy chief of mission at the Israeli embassy in Washington. Later, he became Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, 1984-1988. At the UN, Netanyahu gained international visibility. His sharp debating skills, fluent English, and media-savvy presence made him stand out. While many Israeli diplomats struggled with the often hostile environment of the UN, Netanyahu thrived. He defended Israel against criticism, challenged hostile resolutions, and built relationships with key figures in the US media and government. It was during this period that Netanyahu refined the qualities that would define his political career: a relentless focus on security, a mastery of communication, and a flair for turning every platform into a stage. He understood the power of television and used it effectively, appearing frequently on American talk shows to present Israel's perspective. At a time when Israel faced growing international scrutiny, Netanyahu became one of its most recognizable defenders. By the late 1980s, his transition from diplomat to politician was almost inevitable. Netanyahu returned to Israel and entered the political arena as a member of the Likud party, Israel's main right-wing political faction. His rise within the party was rapid. Young, charismatic, and already well-known abroad, he quickly gained a following at home. He positioned himself as a tough, articulate leader who could stand up to Israel's enemies and represent the country with confidence on the world stage. The combination of soldier, scholar, and diplomat gave Netanyahu a unique profile. He was a decorated veteran, an MIT graduate, a global expert on terrorism, and a master communicator. Few Israeli politicians had such a resume, and Netanyahu used it to full advantage. By the early 1990s, he was no longer just a rising star. He was seen as a future prime minister in the making. Netanyahu's journey from the battlefields of Sayeret Matkal to the podiums of the United Nations showed the evolution of a man shaped by war, loss, and ambition. He had learned to speak the language of both soldiers and statesmen, to move between the worlds of military discipline and political theater. These experiences prepared him for the next stage of his life, the fierce and often brutal arena of Israeli politics, where he would soon rise to the very top. By the early 1990s, Benjamin Netanyahu had become one of Israel's most recognizable political figures. His charisma, international reputation, and strong communication skills set him apart from many of his rivals. But it was the turbulent events of the decade that propelled him into the center of Israeli politics. The 1990s were a time of immense change in the Middle East. The Cold War had ended, and the United States emerged as the dominant global power. The Gulf War in 1991 reshaped regional dynamics, while the Oslo Accords of 1993, signed between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, created hope for a new era of peace. Many Israelis believed that reconciliation with the Palestinians was finally possible. But not everyone agreed. Netanyahu, then a rising star in the Likud party, emerged as one of the fiercest critics of Oslo. He warned that the peace process was naive and dangerous, arguing that Israel's concessions would be exploited by its enemies. His message resonated with Israelis who were skeptical about Arafat's intentions or who feared that peace would come at the expense of security. Tragedy soon struck. In 1995, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist opposed to the peace process. The nation was shocked, and Rabin's successor, Shimon Peres, carried the Oslo agenda forward. But Peres struggled to maintain the same authority and trust. A wave of terrorist attacks in Israel shook public confidence in the peace process, fueling Netanyahu's message that security must always come before compromise. In 1996, Israel held direct elections for prime minister for the first time in its history. Netanyahu, at just 46 years old, ran against Peres. The campaign was bitter and polarizing. Netanyahu positioned himself as the defender of Israeli security, portraying Peres as reckless in trusting Arafat. His slogan, Netanyahu, making a secure peace, captured his strategy, not rejecting peace entirely, but framing himself as the only leader who could achieve it safely. The election was incredibly close. Many expected Peres to win easily, riding the wave of Rabin's legacy. But in a stunning upset, Netanyahu narrowly defeated him. At 46, he became the youngest prime minister in Israel's history. His victory signaled a major shift. The peace process would no longer be pursued without deep skepticism and demands for stronger guarantees of security. The challenges of leadership Netanyahu. His first term as prime minister, 1996-1999, was defined by tension, both with the Palestinians and within his own government. Unlike his predecessors, he had little governing experience. He entered office with sharp instincts and media skills, but lacked the political networks and patience often required for long-term leadership. Still, he moved quickly to establish his positions. Netanyahu did not cancel the Oslo Accords, but he slowed their implementation. He insisted that Palestinian leaders fulfill all their commitments to prevent terrorism before Israel made further concessions. This hardline stance created friction with Arafat and complicated relations with the United States, which was strongly invested in the peace process. In 1997, Netanyahu signed the Hebron Protocol, agreeing to a partial withdrawal of Israeli forces from Hebron, a city in the West Bank. It was a controversial decision that angered some of his right-wing supporters, who accused him of betraying his campaign promises. But Netanyahu framed the move as necessary for Israel's security and for maintaining U.S. support. The episode highlighted the constant balancing act of his leadership. He sought to project toughness while also navigating the pressures of international diplomacy. One of Netanyahu's defining traits as prime minister was his ability to dominate the media narrative. He held frequent press conferences, appeared regularly on television, and cultivated a strong personal image. But behind the scenes, his leadership style was criticized as confrontational and divisive. Coalition politics in Israel required compromise, and Netanyahu often clashed with his allies as well as his opponents. Relations with the United States. Netanyahu's relationship with the U.S. during his first term was complicated. President Bill Clinton had invested heavily in the peace process and often found Netanyahu frustrating. Clinton viewed him as resistant, suspicious, and overly combative in negotiations. The two men clashed repeatedly, with Clinton reportedly finding Netanyahu arrogant and difficult to trust. Yet Netanyahu also understood the importance of U.S. support. He worked hard to build ties with American political figures, Jewish organizations, and the evangelical Christian community. Even when relations with the White House were strained, Netanyahu maintained strong backing from influential groups in the U.S., laying the foundation for his long-term ability to navigate American politics. Domestic struggles. Inside Israel, Netanyahu faced growing criticism. The economy was sluggish, and his promises of greater security were tested by ongoing violence. Terrorist attacks continued, leaving many Israelis doubtful of his ability to deliver the safety he had promised. Meanwhile, accusations of corruption and mismanagement began to swirl around his government. His leadership style also generated controversy. Many described him as a brilliant communicator but a poor manager. Ministers complained of being sidelined, and coalition partners grew increasingly frustrated with his uncompromising approach. Netanyahu's tendency to focus on short-term survival rather than long-term consensus building created instability within his government. The Wye River Memorandum. In 1998, under U.S. mediation, Netanyahu signed the Wye River Memorandum with Arafat, outlining further Israeli withdrawals from the West Bank in exchange for Palestinian security commitments. While the agreement earned praise internationally, it angered many of Netanyahu's right-wing supporters. They accused him of giving away too much, and his coalition began to fracture. By 1999, Netanyahu's government was weakened by internal divisions, economic challenges, and public dissatisfaction. In the elections that year, he lost to Ehud Barak of the Labour Party. It was a humiliating defeat for a man who had risen so quickly and projected an image of invincibility. Netanyahu resigned as Likud leader and temporarily stepped away from politics. A brief exit, but not the end. Netanyahu's first term as prime minister ended in disappointment, but it was far from the end of his story. His tenure revealed both his strengths and weaknesses, his unmatched ability to communicate and inspire confidence, and his tendency to alienate allies and struggle with governance. Many thought his career might be over after 1999, but Netanyahu was not a man who accepted defeat easily. The coming years would show his resilience. After a brief retreat from politics, he would reinvent himself, returning to the center of Israeli politics with even greater force. The lessons of his first term, the dangers of overpromising, the need to manage coalitions, and the importance of maintaining public trust would shape his strategy in the years ahead. Netanyahu's rise and fall in the 1990s mirrored Israel's own turbulent journey during the decade. A nation caught between hope for peace and fear of insecurity, between the dream of reconciliation and the reality of conflict. For Netanyahu, the 1990s were both a triumph and a trial, a period that tested his leadership and prepared him for the battles that still lay ahead. When Benjamin Netanyahu lost the 1999 election to Ehud Barak, many assumed his political career was finished. He had risen fast, fallen hard, and resigned as Likud leader. For a time, it looked as though he would fade into history as a one-term prime minister. Yet Netanyahu was not a man to retreat permanently. His career would soon prove one of the most remarkable comebacks in modern politics. After stepping back from politics, Netanyahu turned to the private sector, giving lectures and working in finance. But his hunger for influence never disappeared. In the early 2000s, as Israel faced the violence of the Second Intifada, a brutal wave of Palestinian uprisings marked by suicide bombings and attacks, Netanyahu's message of security and strength regained relevance. Many Israelis who once doubted him began to reconsider. In 2002, Netanyahu returned to government as foreign minister under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. A year later, he became finance minister, where he demonstrated an entirely different side of his leadership. Netanyahu implemented sweeping economic reforms, cutting welfare programs, privatizing state-owned companies, and reducing taxes. His policies were controversial, but credited with transforming Israel's economy into a more dynamic, globally competitive system. Supporters praised him for modernizing Israel's finances. Critics argued he widened social inequality. When Sharon left the Likud party to form Kadima, Netanyahu reclaimed the leadership of Likud. Although he lost the 2006 election, he positioned himself as the chief critic of government policies, waiting patiently for his moment. That moment arrived in 2009, when public dissatisfaction with security and politics brought him back to power. The second premiership, 2009-2021. Netanyahu's second act as prime minister lasted more than a decade, making him Israel's longest-serving leader. These years transformed both Israel and Netanyahu's image. He became a master of survival, outmaneuvering rivals, reshaping the political landscape, and turning himself into a dominant force who seemed impossible to replace. His second tenure was defined by three major themes: security, economic growth, and global diplomacy. Security and the Iran question. Netanyahu built his political brand on the promise of protecting Israel against existential threats. Central to this was his relentless opposition to Iran's nuclear program. He repeatedly warned that Iran sought nuclear weapons that could annihilate Israel, and he made this issue his top international priority. In 2015, Netanyahu delivered a dramatic speech before the U.S. Congress, directly challenging President Barack Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. The move was highly unusual, a foreign leader openly lobbying against the policy of a sitting American president. Critics accused him of damaging U.S.-Israeli relations, but Netanyahu's supporters saw it as proof of his willingness to fight for Israel's survival at any cost. Netanyahu also presided over multiple military operations in Gaza, responding to rocket attacks with force. These campaigns underscored his uncompromising approach to security, though they also drew international criticism over civilian casualties. Still, many Israelis credited him with keeping the country relatively safe during turbulent times. Economic achievements. Domestically, Netanyahu capitalized on his earlier reforms as finance minister. Under his leadership, Israel's economy grew steadily, driven by its booming technology sector, sometimes dubbed the startup nation. Foreign investment increased, unemployment dropped, and Israel became a hub for innovation. For many Israelis, Netanyahu was the architect of modern prosperity. Yet critics argued that his policies neglected the poor and widened the gap between rich and poor. Housing prices soared, sparking widespread protests in 2011. Netanyahu's image as an economic reformer was tempered by growing frustration over inequality and the rising cost of living. Diplomatic breakthroughs. Perhaps Netanyahu's most surprising achievement was in diplomacy. For decades, Israel had struggled to normalize relations with its Arab neighbors. But under Netanyahu, this began to change. In 2020, with U.S. mediation, Israel signed the Abraham Accords, establishing diplomatic ties with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. The agreements were historic, breaking decades of regional isolation and opening new opportunities for trade, tourism, and security cooperation. For Netanyahu, the Abraham Accords were a vindication of his strategy. Peace could be achieved not by conceding to the Palestinians, but by bypassing them, building ties with Arab states based on mutual interests against Iran and economic cooperation. Supporters hailed him as a visionary who reshaped the Middle East. Critics argued he sidelined the Palestinian issue, leaving the core conflict unresolved. The shadow of controversy. While Netanyahu's achievements were undeniable, his long years in power were also clouded by scandal and division. Netanyahu was accused of cultivating an increasingly polarizing style of leadership. He portrayed himself as the sole protector of Israel, often framing opponents, the media, and even parts of the judiciary as enemies. His critics accused him of eroding democratic norms and concentrating too much power in his hands. The greatest challenge to his legitimacy, however, came from corruption allegations. Prosecutors charged him in multiple cases, accusing him of accepting lavish gifts, manipulating media coverage in exchange for favors, and abusing his office. Netanyahu denied all charges, dismissing them as a political witch hunt. His legal troubles became a defining feature of his later years in office, dominating headlines and deepening divisions in Israeli society. Despite the scandals, Netanyahu demonstrated an extraordinary ability to survive politically. He repeatedly won elections or managed to form coalitions, even when it seemed his career was on the verge of collapse. His mastery of political maneuvering, building and breaking alliances, exploiting rivalries, and maintaining a strong base of loyal supporters earned him the nickname the Magician. The fall from power. By 2021, however, years of controversy, corruption trials, and political gridlock took their toll. Israel went through a series of inconclusive elections, leaving the country in prolonged political crisis. Eventually, an unlikely coalition of parties from across the political spectrum united with one common goal: to remove Netanyahu from office. In June 2021, Netanyahu was finally ousted after 12 consecutive years as prime minister. His rival, Naftali Bennett, became the new leader, supported by a coalition that stretched from right-wing nationalists to Arab parties. For the first time in over a decade, Israel had a government not led by Netanyahu. Yet even in defeat, Netanyahu refused to step aside. He remained leader of the Likud party, continued to rally his supporters, and promised a return. For him, losing office was not the end. It was another chapter in his long career of survival and comebacks. A legacy in the making. Netanyahu's years from 2009 to 2021 reshaped Israel. He presided over unprecedented economic growth, historic diplomatic breakthroughs, and a consistent hardline approach to security. He also left behind a deeply divided society. a political system strained by corruption scandals and a reputation as both Israel's protector and its most controversial leader. For supporters, Netanyahu was the statesman who safeguarded Israel, strengthened its economy, and expanded its global standing. For critics, he was a populist who undermined democratic norms, fostered division, and prioritized personal survival over national unity. But one thing was clear. Netanyahu had secured his place as one of the most consequential leaders in Israel's history. Whether loved or hated, admired or despised, his impact was undeniable. When Benjamin Netanyahu was forced out of office in June 2021 after 12 consecutive years as prime minister, many believed his era had finally ended. His corruption trials were underway, his rivals had united against him, and the Israeli public seemed weary of the endless political gridlock he symbolized. For a moment, it appeared that Netanyahu's long, turbulent reign had come to a close. But if his career had taught the world anything, it was this. Netanyahu never truly leaves the stage. The road back to power. As opposition leader, Netanyahu wasted no time in undermining the fragile coalition that replaced him. The government led by Naftali Bennett and later Yair Lapid was ideologically diverse, ranging from right-wing nationalists to left-wing liberals and even Arab parties. It survived on unity against Netanyahu, not shared vision. Internal disagreements weakened it from the start. Meanwhile, Netanyahu remained a relentless force. He used his position as head of the Likud party to rally his base, sharpen his narrative of victimhood, and portray the corruption trials as a conspiracy to silence him. He argued that only he had the experience, strength, and determination to safeguard Israel at a time of rising global uncertainty. In November 2022, Israel held yet another election, the fifth in less than 4 years. This time, Netanyahu and his right-wing allies won a clear majority. Against all odds, he returned to power, forming the most right-leaning government in Israel's history. It was a stunning comeback, even for a man long known as the magician. The sixth premiership, Netanyahu's sixth term as prime minister, began with dramatic ambition. His coalition included ultra-Orthodox parties and far-right nationalists, giving him a firm majority, but also tying him to controversial partners. Early on, his government proposed sweeping judicial reforms that would weaken the independence of Israel as Supreme Court and give more power to the parliament and executive branch. The proposals sparked a massive backlash. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets in some of the largest protests in the nation's history. Critics accused Netanyahu of undermining democracy to protect himself from his ongoing corruption trial. Supporters argued that the reforms were necessary to rein in unelected judges and restore balance to the political system. The crisis exposed deep divisions within Israeli society, between secular and religious, liberal and conservative, urban and rural. For many, it was a struggle over the very soul of Israel. Once again, Netanyahu found himself at the center of national conflict, admired by loyalists and vilified by opponents. Security challenges and global diplomacy. As in every stage of his career, Netanyahu's government also faced security challenges. Violence in the West Bank escalated, Gaza remained volatile, and tensions with Iran persisted. Netanyahu continued to emphasize his role as Israel's ultimate protector, warning that only he could navigate the dangers of a hostile region. On the international stage, he sought to expand the achievements of the Abraham Accords, pushing for normalization with Saudi Arabia. Though complex, the prospect of such a breakthrough carried historic significance. For Netanyahu, success in this area could cement his legacy as the leader who reshaped Israel's place in the Middle East. At the same time, his relations with the United States remained complicated. While President Joe Biden maintained the U.S. commitment to Israel's security, his administration expressed concern over Netanyahu's far-right coalition partners and the controversial judicial overhaul. Once again, Netanyahu walked a delicate line between preserving Israel's alliance with Washington and pursuing his own domestic agenda. The shadow of corruption trials. Despite his return to power, Netanyahu's corruption trials continued to cast a long shadow. He faced charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, accusations that could, in theory, end his political career if he were convicted. Yet the very fact that he managed to win re-election while under indictment highlighted his resilience and political skill. To his supporters, the charges symbolized a witch hunt orchestrated by elites who could not defeat him at the ballot box. To his critics, they were evidence of a leader willing to corrupt institutions for personal gain. The trials became part of the broader struggle over Israel's democratic future, with Netanyahu both the symbol of its strength and its fragility. The man and the myth. At this stage of his life, Netanyahu had already secured his place as one of the most consequential leaders in Israeli history. He had outlasted rivals, outmaneuvered enemies, and redefined the boundaries of power. He was Israel's longest-serving prime minister, surpassing even David Ben-Gurion, the country's founding father. But what, ultimately, was his legacy? For supporters, Netanyahu was the man who kept Israel safe, modernized its economy, and elevated its global standing. They saw him as a statesman who understood the realities of a dangerous region, who refused to gamble with Israel's security, and who delivered historic diplomatic victories like the Abraham Accords. For critics, he was a divisive populist who eroded democratic institutions, fueled social divisions, and clung to power at all costs. They accused him of prioritizing personal survival over national unity, of exploiting fear rather than offering hope, and of entrenching a politics of conflict rather than compromise. Conclusion: a legacy, still in motion. The story of Benjamin Netanyahu is not just about one man, but about the evolution of Israel itself. His life mirrors the nation's journey, born in struggle, hardened by war, tested by loss, driven by survival, and constantly balancing the dreams of peace with the realities of conflict. From the battlefields of Sayeret Matkal to the halls of the United Nations, from the heartbreak of Yoni's death at Entebbe to the triumph of the Abraham Accords, Netanyahu's path has been one of resilience and determination. He has been hailed as a savior, condemned as a manipulator, celebrated as a visionary, and criticized as a threat to democracy. What cannot be denied is his extraordinary staying power. Time and again, when counted out, he has returned. Time and again, when facing crises, he has endured. Time and again, when challenged, he has found a way to survive. As of today, Netanyahu remains at the heart of Israel's political life, shaping its future while embodying its contradictions. His story is not yet finished. Whether history remembers him as a defender of Israel or as a cautionary tale of power, as corrupting grip will depend not only on the final chapters of his career, but also on how future generations interpret the choices he made. For now, he stands as one of the most influential, controversial, and enduring leaders of the modern era, a man whose life is inseparable from the fate of his nation.